Hello, my name is Abraham Mhaidli, and today I'll be talking about work I did with my colleagues at University of Michigan, looking at how mobile app developers monetize their apps through advertising. 50% of mobile apps use ads, and by extension, advertising networks. For those who might not know, advertising networks are companies that connect app developers with advertisers. So if I develop an app and I want to put ads in it, instead of contacting like Coca-Cola directly, to have ads in my app, I contact an advertising network, they contact the advertisers, and then the advertising network put ads into apps for me. Examples include Google AdMob, InMobi, and Startup. So for a brief overview of how this process works, let's assume we have a developer with a mobile app they want to monetize. They first use an SDK provided by the advertising network, and then by integrating necessary lines of code, they say, I want to put an ad here. Then, whenever an ordinary user uses my app, the ad network receives data from the app, such as the device user ID, the location, etc., and thus selectively decides what specific ad to show that specific user at that specific moment in time. And though it seems like the ad network is in charge of what ads appear, the developers can exercise some control. They can show, for example, if there are categories of ads that are banned, like maybe they don't want to show car ads or apparel ads. They can control to some degree what data is sent to the ad network, so maybe they don't want to send precise user location or the age and gender of the user, and they can even choose whether to show targeted ads or non-targeted ads. And ads are great, except this would be a pretty boring presentation if they were, and there are many consumer risks that exist. So first, many ad networks engage in targeted advertising, which requires pervasive data collection, raising privacy concerns. There are ads that have been known to redirect users towards malware. Ads can be creepy, frustrating, and annoying for users. Ads can lead to consumerism and the sale of harmful products such as alcohol, gambling, fast foods, and a long, long list of etceteras. And many proposals have been put forward to manage the consumer risks of advertising, such as technical systems that allow ad targeting to occur locally on the user's device and thus not send data to ad networks. But little is known about how app developers reason about and integrate ads, which to me is key knowledge to have. If you want to solve a problem as complicated as those posed by advertising, you need the perspective of every stakeholder in the system. And if you're missing a key player, such as app developers, then it's doubtful how effective proposals will actually be. So we delved into the literature to see what work had been done. Not surprising, there's been a lot of work detailing the consumer risks of advertising networks, the privacy, security, and other risks. With regards to developer behaviors, we looked at three key areas: information selection, tool seeking, and privacy and security behaviors. With regards to information seeking and tool selection, one key theme is that developers rely on their work environment, their colleagues, their professional friends to choose what tools to use and how they look for information. And with regards to privacy and security behaviors, one common theme is that developers often want to have good privacy and security practices, but fail to do so for a variety of reasons, such as not understanding the privacy policies of the third-party tools they are using. And most notably, there's been not a lot of work looking at advertising networks specifically from the perspective of app developers and how app developers reason about and use ads. And so this is an area we wanted to focus on to better understand how app developers reason about and integrate ads. And we had sort of four key areas of focus that we took as sort of the process by which an app developer put ads into their app. So first, why do they decide to use advertising in the first place instead of charging a flat dollar fee for their users or any other monetization model? How do they choose an advertising network once they decide to use advertising? How do they configure ads into their app once they've chosen an advertising network? And once the ads are there, how do they manage the consumer risks that advertising poses? To do this, we conducted a mixed method study consisting of a survey and interview component. In the survey, we asked quantitative questions about their app experience, their advertising network usage, and general behaviors and attitudes. And in the interview, we probed in depth regarding the rationale and sort of the why to these behaviors. Our target population were app developers who had monetized their apps through advertising in the past. We managed to recruit 49 app developers for the survey and 10 for the interview. Given difficulties in recruiting, our sample largely consisted of small independent app developers. And so we caveat our findings by saying they might not generalize to larger app development companies. So that's what we did. And now to move on to our findings. So to remind ourselves what we were looking at, our first question had to do with why do developers choose to use advertising in the first place? So not surprisingly, advertising was key to our participants. I mean, we were recruiting people who'd worked with advertising. Google AdMob was the one that was used the most. And in fact, for 40% of our participants, advertising was the only monetization model they'd ever used. And so when we asked why, the interviews gave a bit of nuance to this in that ads were used because of necessity, or rather a belief of necessity. App developers believed that if they didn't use ads, no one was going to pick up their app, given that there's going to be another one next to it that's exactly the same and free. And so they were not going to make any money off of their apps. One interviewee put it in dire terms. If it wasn't for advertising, almost all the independent app developers would basically just die. Thus, they feel they have to use advertising. And the key thing to note here is they don't think advertising is like the best model or like a good model. They think it is the only model. So they're almost resigned and like, I have to use advertising. It's the only way I'm going to make money. But this contrasted with the fact that they're generally dissatisfied with the amount of money that they get from advertising. In the interview, all the small independent app developers kept complaining, I'm not making a lot of money. The ad network is taking a really large cut. Like, I could have thousands of users using my app, but like I make so little money per user that I'm not really making a lot of money. And in the survey, we asked participants, did you switch advertising networks while working on an app? And if so, why? All of the ones who switched said that money was a very or extremely important reason for switching, suggesting that dissatisfaction with revenue gotten is strong enough to like push people towards another advertising network. And so we see this interesting paradox between, on the one hand, app developers saying advertising is the only way to make money from apps, and actually you don't make money from advertising in apps. So a second area of focus was how do app developers choose an advertising network? What factors do they value, and how do they go about selecting one? So first, we asked what resources they use to pick an advertising network. So to briefly explain this graph, the colored parts in blue show the number of participants who said that resource was very or extremely important when choosing an advertising network. And here, the official website and online discussions forums were very important, followed by colleagues, professional networks, and friends, slightly different from other literature that suggests that colleagues, professional network, and friends were most important. And the interviews gave some nuance to this process and showed that developers do not really put a lot of time and energy researching what ad networks to use. And the process went something like this. So first, there were rough heuristics used to determine which ones to look at, like which one or two to look at. Stuff like, like I read it on a forum somewhere, or like I've heard Google AdMob is like big. And I cannot emphasize how rough some of these heuristics were. More than one participant said something along the lines of, I'm making apps for Android, Google owns Android, therefore Google will clearly work the best. And then once they'd come up with this like one or two advertising networks to look at, they would go to the official website. If it looked okay and sort of not sketchy, they would try it. And if it worked, they would stick with it. And they wouldn't really go much beyond that. So not a lot of work being put into choosing an advertising network. And the important thing to note is that they would rarely change the advertising network, even if there were problems, and only do so if it was completely broken. In our survey, only 20% of our participants had ever switched advertising networks. And in our interviews, people kept saying, even though they had minor complaints about revenue or minor complaints about technical problems, they would generally, once they picked an advertising network, stick with it and not really optimize for money or for anything unless the advertising network was completely broken. We also asked app developers, what do you value in an advertising network? What do you want? And here, app developers claim to value user security, user satisfaction, and user privacy, more so than even revenue. Now, of course, they could be lying to us, but in the interviews, there were many unprompted comments and unprompted remarks, such as, I really want to take care of my users, or I chose this because I don't like it when companies do it to me, so I'm not going to do it to my users, which suggests that this care is genuine. So on the one hand, it seems that app developers do value their users and want good user security, satisfaction, and privacy. But that's not the end of the story. In the survey, remember, we asked, why did you switch advertising networks? And all the participants who switched advertising networks did so for money. OK, so this means that money is actually more important. And in the interviews, people kept bringing up ease of integration, saying, I really like this advertising network, or I wanted to choose this one because it looked super easy to put into my app. Or I didn't really like this one because it was super hassle to get the ads working. So how can we explain these dissonant findings? We suspect there's an underlying tension between, on the one hand, developers really wanting better user security, better using app experience, and respecting the user privacy. Like, that's what they want. But at the end of the day, when it comes time to putting ads in your app and like rent is due at the end of the month, then money and the ability to implement ads easily, those take precedence. Now to our third question, how do app developers configure the ads in their app? And here we saw that there was an overwhelming default bias, and participants would generally stick to the default settings provided. Now, this in itself is not surprising. We all stick to default settings. But what is surprising is that they stuck with these settings even when these settings went against their wishes of like generating more revenue or their wish to have privacy-preserving apps. And this led to some very interesting contradictions. So, for example, one thing developers can choose to do is, to some degree, what data is sent to the ad network. And they can choose to send, like precise location, age and gender of their users, etc. And developers didn't really do that. They just stuck with the bare minimum and wouldn't go out of their way to send more data to the advertising network. And the idea is, presumably, the more data you send, the better targeting the ad network can do, and so the more money you seek to earn. And so when we asked, why don't you send more data, they were like, oh, we want to preserve the privacy of our users, which is fine. However, another thing developers can choose is whether to show targeted or non-targeted ads. The default is to show targeted ads, so developers will show targeted ads. And when we asked why, they said, oh, we chose targeted ads because we want to make more money. But if you want to make more money, why aren't you sending the more data, which will lead to better targeting and so have more money for you? And thus we see that even though they try to rationalize it by having, I want more money or I want privacy-preserving apps, they're really just sticking to the default settings even when these contradict each other and when it doesn't work in their interests. So there's this very interesting default bias that exists. And lastly, how do app developers manage the consumer risks that advertising poses? And the short answer is they really don't. Namely because they view it as the advertising network's responsibility for fixing the consumer risks. In our survey, 50% of those surveys said that ad networks were completely responsible for fixing the consumer risks, versus only 2 people who said app developers and 4 people who said like a government agency, such as the FTC. And in the interview, they shed some light over why this was the case, and they expressed sort of, on the one hand, very little agency, like there's not much that they could do, and on the second, responsibility. Ad networks were the one who puts ads in. Why do I have to worry about it? Let them deal with it. And so they did very little in terms of monitoring their apps or proactively trying to, mitigate the consumer risks of advertising. Thus, to summarize our findings, mobile app developers use advertising mostly out of resignation and a belief that they have to use advertising. They don't spend too much time researching what advertising network to use. They stick to default settings even when it goes against their financial or privacy-preserving interests. And they believe it is not their responsibility to fix issues with advertising networks, viewing themselves as having little agency and little responsibility. And so looking at these findings, we saw several opportunities for future work and for intervention. So the first is to better support developers in choosing app monetization models. So we saw this interesting paradox between, on the one hand, developers saying advertising is the only way to make money from apps, and actually you don't make money from advertising in apps, which suggests that maybe the conventional wisdom that advertising is the best and only way to monetize your apps is wrong. And so more information on what monetization models work in what circumstances and for what apps is needed. And this information needs to be presented loud and clear to developers. We imagine a website maybe where an app developer could go on, say, I want to create app X with these characteristics, and the website would spit back, use monetization model Y. Or maybe have a table with the pros and cons of different monetization models. Not only would this help developers make more informed and more profitable decisions over what monetization model to use, but perhaps it could encourage app developers to pick monetization models that they wouldn't have otherwise, and maybe move away from advertising and away from the consumer risks that advertising poses. Second, area of future work could be to rethinking the ad network default. So we saw app developers had an overwhelming default bias and would generally stick with the default settings. Given that some of these settings were directly tied to consumer risks, maybe we could mandate that ad networks change their defaults to have consumer-friendly settings. Maybe the bare minimum of data needed to be sent to the ad network could be kept even lower. Maybe certain categories of products, such as fast food, gambling, alcohol, could be blocked by default. Maybe the default could be having non-targeted instead of targeted ads. So changing these defaults could go a long way in changing the way ads are set up in apps, and thus could have a huge impact on the consumer risks or the prevalence of these consumer risks. And in fact, there's now a lot of debate and contention in Europe through the GDPR of actually deciding what these settings should be. And lastly, we advocate sort of encouraging developer responsibility. So we saw that developers, said, not my problem, and I can't really do much about problems with advertising, leave it to the advertising networks. And this might seem true at first, developers are small fish in the pond, and advertising networks are big, large companies, and they are the ones who are in charge of advertising. But there are little things that developers can do, right? There are ways they can configure their apps to control what data is sent to the advertising network, what categories of ads to show, little things like that. They are the ones who choose to use advertising in the first place and choose to use ad networks. And there can even be, as part of that ecosystem, they can affect change and maybe even have more, collective action or small joint action together. And so we advocate encouraging developer responsibility, but a special form of responsibility, positive responsibility. Usually when we talk about responsibility, we talk about blame, right? Advertising networks are in charge of ads are bad, therefore blame the advertising network. And we don't want to do that to developers. What we want to do is sort of encourage this positive responsibility that acknowledges that we're all in this advertising ecosystem together, app developers, advertising networks, and consumers, and it's all on us to try to make advertising as good and try to mitigate the problems of advertising as much as possible. And so we want to encourage this sort of thinking. This sort of thinking can be encouraged in classes and app development tutorials and modules, or even when the advertising network is sort of giving its tutorial on how to use its SDK, it could have specific sections about consumer risks and what developers can do to mitigate them. Or maybe incentives can be offered to developers. Maybe developers who proactively show consumer-friendly practices can receive a token, sort of free trade token type thing, letting consumers know that they actually are using the developers are trying to enact consumer-friendly practices. Thus, in conclusion, mobile app developers use advertising out of resignation and belief of necessity, suggesting that maybe more accurate information about what monetization models work under what circumstances is needed. They overwhelmingly stick with default bias, suggesting that maybe one area of intervention could be mandating advertising networks to have consumer-friendly defaults. And they think it is the ad network's responsibility to manage consumer risk, suggesting that maybe we should encourage positive responsibility through either classes or incentives for app developers. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Corey Fackleris. I'm from Carnegie Mellon University. Thank you so much for this great work. I think we definitely have a lot more challenges ahead across the internet for advertising challenges. But one comment I have is I actually like advertising. Maybe I'm the weirdo in the room, but I love that it saves me time in finding other apps to download or things to buy. But I definitely don't like ad networks. Do you see in your research, and this might be out of scope, are there any alternatives to using ad networks, such as sourcing individual ads to display?
You mean alternatives for ad networks for displaying ads?
Yeah, I mean, say if I'm an independent app developer and I just want to make back at least as much money as I have to pay for my developer license. Do you see, in your study, is there anybody individually recruiting advertisers?
No. Everyone stuck with advertising networks. And in fact, even like I said, our sample was largely small independent app developers, but we did manage to get some people working in large companies, and even they used advertising networks. It seems like you could, if you wanted to, contact specific companies and be like, advertising my work. But I think for a lot of app developers, they just wanted ads in their app to work. They didn't want to go out of their way. They didn't want to spend a lot of time putting advertising into their apps. They just wanted something that worked. And so advertising networks are just so convenient for them that there are other options that could theoretically exist, but they don't use them.
Have you had a chance to get any feedback on your work from these ad networks?
I have not. Not yet. This is the first time presenting this work.
Yeah, I'd love to see them take up your recommendations.
Me too, but we'll see.
Thank you.
Actually, for our next speaker, wouldn't mind just coming up and starting setup?
Hello, I'm Jeffrey Goldberg from 1Password. I'm wondering if you've looked at any of the literature in behavioral economics and behavioral decision making, because what I'm seeing in your discrepancy between revealed preferences and defaults or reference points is the kind of thing that behavioral economists look at quite a bit, as they do also at satisficing, finding the first working solution. And so I'm just recommending that literature broadly.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, we looked a little bit, where we could definitely look more into that literature.
Hey, Dan Cosley, Cornell and NSF. Did people talk about where they got this belief in necessity? Right, because that might be really useful for doing some of the things that you're thinking about doing around recommending monetization models and stuff.
Could you say that again? I didn't quite hear.
Oh, sorry. I guess I was too far from the mic. Do you have thought? Did anyone talk about where they got this belief of necessity from? Right? Was it just from looking at the app ecosystem, or did they get that from the forums too? Because that'd be really useful for thinking about how to structure these recommenders for monetization models and stuff.
It was a combination of both like informal, like, so the rough heuristics used in advertising networks were similarly like rough heuristics, like, oh yeah, like I read in forums somewhere that, like, you know, advertising is the only way to make it. And I think also personal experience played a bigger role. Like they said, oh, I wouldn't pay for an app, therefore no one in the world is going to pay for an app. So I think they both use these rough heuristics and their own personal experience.
So actually, I had a quick question. I'm kind of curious about how you manage to recruit app developers to begin with. I know a lot of people have been trying to do that, and it can be a challenging thing to do.
With a lot of difficulties. So at first I thought, you know, I'll just post it in Reddit, like one of the subreddits for Android development, and it'll be fine. And then I got no responses, and then I posted in more subreddits. Then I posted in sort of like Facebook groups. Then I went to app developer meetups. Then I, like, you know, got people's information from the App Store and started contacting them directly. And I think that proved the most effective, sort of like going to the App Store, seeing app developers like emails and like pinging them and being like, hey, do you want to take part in this study? That was the most effective, but that might be why I mostly got independent app developers, since independent app developers, it's like their email and they're more likely to check it. Whereas for larger app development companies, it goes to like a sort of customer support and they just like throw it away. So a lot of difficulties. I'd be happy to talk more about the different methods offline also.
Sounds great. All right. Well, let's thank the speaker.